Thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate it as we kick off the fall series of our New Energy Conversations. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the Academic Director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And we have really had a blast this past year and a quarter or so helping to host this series of young scholars in energy and society to share their work. We started it for a number of reasons, and we've been really enjoying the conversation with people from a whole wide range of research topic areas. And we hope that you're enjoying it as well. And we're looking forward to a great series this fall. So we're starting things off with Dr. Abel Gustafson from the University of Cincinnati, where he is an assistant professor of public relations and environmental communication. He is also a research affiliate at the YALE Center for Climate Change Communication, which is an amazing shop. He has a really wonderful applied focus in his research that you're going to hear more about today. And he developed his research agenda from doing hhis master's at the University of Manoa in Hawaii and a PhD at UC Santa Barbara. And so he also there's another feature in his background that I particularly took note of. My PhD is in communications. And so I really popped out when I saw that Abel won the 2018 Doctoral Dissertation of the Year award from the National Communication Association's Environmental Communications Division. So congratulations to you on that. And that is that's an important piece of work. His work has also been covered since then in a whole number of venues, from the Washington Post to Grist to the Atlantic, National Geographic. So his work is out there, and I encourage us all to take a look and follow up more to see what he's been up to and what he's going to be up to in the future after we hear his talk. His talk today is Renewable Energy, Public Opinion, and Strategies for Effective Communication. And so with that, Abel, I'd like to hand it back over to you to take it away. I'm going to go dark, but I will come back when it's time for questions and answers and moderate that conversation. So welcome, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate this time that you're sharing with me. It's great to be able to talk with all of you and to be hosted by the Irving Institute. Today, we're going to be talking about a kind of a general overview of public opinion on renewable energy, the current landscape and where we've been and how it's changed over time and where the trend is currently going on public opinion. And then we'll also connect that to strategic communication, how we can use these insights from what we learn when we study what people believe and why, how we can use those insights to be more effective as we communicate about these issues to various groups of the public. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we will go ahead and get started. So as noted, I'm Dr. Abel Gustafson. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati here, and my work focuses mostly on studying what people think about sustainability issues and why they think that way. We can really break my research down into these three different bins: how people think and act regarding sustainability, what motivates them or what causes them to think that way, what's the driving force behind those beliefs and actions, and then how we can develop communication strategies that are most effective on important sustainability topics like climate change, renewable energy, electric vehicles, things like that. So I'm actually going to organize this talk along these same three lines here. First, I'm going to give a broad overview of what people think regarding the topic of renewable energy. And then we'll talk about some recent research by myself and some colleagues that digs into why people think that way. What are their underlying motivations? And then if we understand those underlying motivations, we can do a better job at communicating more effectively. And we'll show some recent examples from communication experiments that show exactly that, some recommendations for strategic communication. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in here. So a lot of this data is coming out of the YALE program on climate change communication in conjunction with the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. I was fortunate to be a postdoc there for a couple of years and was involved in this research. And one of our products during that time was this large report on public opinion about energy among Americans. It was called Energy in the American Mind, released at the very end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And we found some really encouraging things. We found that most Americans, in fact, support requiring electric utilities to use 100% clean renewable energy by 2050. And we're really surprised by this finding because although there's a lot of partisan polarization around the issue of climate change and some other sustainability topics, we found that there was actually really strong bipartisan support for this idea of requiring electric utilities to use 100% clean renewable energy. So this was really encouraging. 71% of Republicans overall either strongly or somewhat supported this proposal, this policy idea. If we break it down a little further into liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, liberal or moderate Republicans, or conservative Republicans, we see that still among conservative Republicans, 64% support this idea of requiring electric utilities to use 100% clean renewable energy. So this is a really encouraging finding. We see that there's actually broad bipartisan support for this. Let me show you another way to visualize this data. We can also look at it across locations. So the YALE program on climate change communication has this fantastic tool called the YALE Climate Opinion Maps, where you can view public opinion at the local level on a whole bunch of different issues. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick and hop over to a web browser so I can demonstrate exactly how this works here. All right, so in this visualization here, we can see the map of the United States and every single county, 3,000 some counties. And this current figure is showing the percent of people in each of those counties that believe that global warming is happening. And the darker red shades are a higher percent of people. And you can hover over any county in the United States and find out the percent of people that believe that global warming is happening. But the interesting thing is it's not just for belief in global warming happening. You could find out how many people are worried about global warming. A few less, it looks like. You could also find out support for various policies like regulating CO2 as a pollutant. There's pretty strong support. Over 70% of the American public supports regulating CO2 as a pollutant. Funding research into renewable energy sources, that's really strong support. I think when last I checked, the county with the lowest support was somewhere here in Texas, and it has over 70% support. And that's the lowest county in terms of support in the country. Should we drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? Very little support for this. So we can see public opinion is pretty strong on energy and sustainability issues around the country, and not quite as divided as it is on climate change itself. So I'll jump back to the slides here. Excellent. All right. And we've seen that this has actually grown over time. So we can track this support for funding renewable energy research over the last 6 years. And we see that there's actually been a reduction in polarization. Conservative Republicans have made massive gains in their support for renewable energy research over the last several years. However, and this was kind of culminating in late 2018, where there was very little difference between the liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans in support for this. However, there's a little bit of drama brewing now. There's a little bit of change in the narrative. As in the last just 3 years, we've actually seen a dramatic decrease in support among Republicans. So just in the last couple of years, we've seen that conservative Republicans have lost all of those gains in support for funding renewable energy research. They've regressed all the way back down to only 50% of conservative Republicans support funding renewable energy research. And we see this also on different metrics. So for example, the percent of Americans who think clean energy should be a very high or high priority for the president and the Congress. Up until about 2018, we saw a general uptrend, and most of the gains were among Republicans. And that resulted in a reduction of polarization on this issue, or at least polarization in perceptions of whether this should be a high priority or not. But then in the last few years, we've seen it turn back the other direction, and polarization has widened considerably. In 2018, 55% of conservative Republicans said they thought clean energy should be either a high or very high priority for the president and Congress. That's a dramatically high number, but now it's only 23%, a really steep change in just a couple of years. And we also see polarization across a whole bunch of different proposed energy policies, like providing tax rebates, funding research into renewable energy sources. As we saw, there's a pretty large divide on regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. transitioning the US economy away from fossil fuels to 100% clean energy by 2050, also a large partisan divide. And then the largest is on this, this question here of requiring at the very bottom, requiring electric utilities to produce 100% of their electricity from wind, solar, or other renewable energy sources by 2035. We see a massive partisan divide on this. So what used to be a fairly strong bipartisan support issue has now kind of devolved into some strong partisan polarization. And that's just happened in the last couple of years. So we're in the middle of this pretty dramatic shift here in opinions. And this isn't unprecedented. There are other instances in which this has happened. We had a recent paper published about a year and a half ago that documented the partisan polarization that developed really quickly on the Green New Deal. So when the conversation nationally just first started about the Green New Deal in late 2018, we measured with a nationally representative survey, we measured how many people were familiar with the Green New Deal. We gave them a little definition of what it was trying to accomplish, and we asked them how much they support it. And then just 4 months later, in the spring of 2019, we did the exact same thing. And we found that there was a large increase in awareness of the Green New Deal because it became a main fixture of the news on both sides. And then also there was large increases in polarization about support for it. So at the start, before very many people heard about it, when we defined the Green New Deal for Republicans and they read the description of it, a bunch of them, about half of them were in support of those ideas. But then after 4 months of hearing about it on the news and it becoming a much more divisive issue, we saw polarization increase quite a bit over just a period of 4 months. So this development of polarization does happen, and it can happen really quickly. So this is that's kind of the current state of public opinion on renewable energy. There's some dramatic shifts going on, although in the very recent past, there was very strong bipartisan support. So let's move now to this question of why do people support renewable energy? What is it that motivates people to think and act in the way that they do? And if we can understand this, if we can understand what it is that's driving people to support these issues, then we can be better at designing communication that connects with those values or those motivations. We can leverage that understanding to be more effective as communicators. So what drives support for renewable energy? There's a lot of really good research on this starting in the early 2000s, especially this book called Cheap and Clean. And it emphasized that people form their opinions about an energy source based on whether they think it is cheap and whether it's clean. Those are the two main factors or perceptions that go into support for an energy source, including renewable energy. So renewable energy has long been cleaner than fossil fuels, but very recently it's also become cheaper than fossil fuels for electricity production in many situations. And we see that some Americans are becoming aware of this. So people do perceive other sources of energy as being more harmful. For example, most Americans think that coal is either extremely, very, or moderately harmful to people's health. Well, very few people think that wind or solar are extremely, very, or moderately harmful to people's health. So people have this kind of intuitive understanding that renewable energy sources like wind and solar are cleaner, they're healthier, they're better for people's health. So that's part of what's driving the overall support for renewable energy. And if we break this down by party, we see that 57% of Republicans here on the top right think that coal is harmful to people's health, and there's really not any partisan polarization on perceptions of wind or solar being harmful to people's health. And we also see that most Americans think that renewable energy policies are going to improve economic growth and create jobs. We see that there's some partisan polarization on this. There's some difference as we move across the political spectrum in perceptions of whether it's going to improve growth in jobs, have no effect, or reduce growth in jobs. But still, among Republicans, there's more people that think that it's going to improve growth in jobs right here in the middle than there are that think it's going to reduce growth in jobs. However, this is from data that was collected in 2018, which is kind of at the peak of Republican support for renewable energy. So an open question is how these perceptions have changed since then. You know, have Republicans shifted in their opinions about the effect that renewable energy development would have on economic growth and job creation. Also, we see that that many Americans, about 1 in 3, think that wind and solar cost less than coal. And the reason that this isn't a majority is probably because so many people just have no idea. There's a lot of people that just don't know what the costs of different electricity sources are, and that's of course understandable. But still, the proportion that think that it costs less is quite a bit more than the proportion that think it costs more. So we see these overall positive opinions about the costs of renewable energy also. And this is perceptions of whether wind and solar will cost more in the future or are going to end up costing less in the future. And those who think it will cost less in the future outnumber those who think it will cost more in the future. So these are some of the reasons why there's general positive opinion about renewable energy in the United States. So what we did is we wanted to dive a little bit deeper and find out what people were saying was their most important reasons to transition to renewable energy. So if we asked people, of all the different possible reasons why it would be important to transition to renewable energy, which of these reasons is the most important? And so we asked people to respond on this list of, I believe, 16 different reasons to transition to renewable energy. And we asked them to rate each reason on a scale of importance, from extremely important, very important, somewhat important, only a little, or not at all important. And we see that the most common reasons as rated either extremely or very important are things like reducing water and air pollution, providing a better life for our children, getting energy from sources that never run out. Over 70% of respondents said that these reasons are either extremely or very important to them. But we also have to recognize that these things might differ across groups. So it may not be the case that everybody thinks that the same reasons are the most important. It's probably not homogeneous. So it could be the case that different groups of people think that different reasons to transition to renewable energy are most important. And that could have an important effect on which communication strategies are most effective. So in a recent study here published in Energy Policy last year, we dove into this. We tried to figure out, do Republicans and Democrats differ in the reasons why they support renewable energy? What's driving this overall support? And what we found using that same measure there, where they rated these different reasons on a scale of importance, there's the mean importance rating broken down by each possible reason to transition to renewable energy and across each party. And we see that among Republicans, the highest rated importance, the highest on the importance rated reasons to transition to renewable energy were to reduce energy costs and to get energy from sources that never run out. Among Democrats, though, we see a little bit different result. They don't follow the same pattern. In fact, the highest importance given to a reason for transitioning to renewable energy was actually among reducing global warming. And that, in fact, was the least important for Republicans. So we see a pretty large difference there in the reasons or the importance of these different reasons to transition to renewable energy, this big difference between Democrats and Republicans. We could also look at these same data as converting it to the percent who responded either extremely or very important for each of these reasons. So for example, Republicans over here say that, or 58% of Republicans say that reducing energy costs is extremely or very important, and 77% of Democrats. We see Democrats overall are rating these reasons as more important than Republicans are, but relatively within a party, these different reasons have different orders of priority. And Democrats tend to give more priority to climate change reducing climate change than they do than Republicans do. We can also look at it like this here. This is probably an easier way to visualize these same data. So what we did is we, in a follow-up question, after asking everybody to rate every reason, in a follow-up question, we asked people to choose just one. What's the single most important reason to transition to renewable energy? If you had to pick just one reason, what would that be? And 32% of Democrats, nearly a third of Democrats, selected reducing global warming as the single most important reason to transition to renewable energy, but only 6% of Republicans did. And conversely, 11% of Republicans selected reducing energy costs as the single most important reason to transition to renewable energy, while only 5% of Democrats did. Republicans also favored increasing America's energy independence more so than Democrats did, and getting energy from sources that never run out more so than Democrats did. So we see some different reasons that arise, that kind of float to the top as being most important, a different set of reasons for Republicans versus Democrats. So knowing these underlying motivations, how can we use that to improve strategic communication? And that's really the most practical question here, because all of this is very interesting, but what can we do about it? How can we use this to make a difference in the world? And this is a really common focus of a lot of communication research, is finding ways to portray different issues, finding ways to frame an issue or a topic, or to use a most effective messenger, or to find a mode of communicating that resonates most with the audience. And we can do this through different communication experiments. So let me give you a quick example of one interesting survey experiment that we did recently. So we wanted to know whether different names for natural gas influence how favorable people perceive it, because we could refer to natural gas, as natural methane gas, as methane gas, fossil gas, fracked gas. There's a bunch of different terms that are out there, although they're not perfectly equivalent. They are often used to refer to the same or similar things. So if we use different terms, how do people feel about it? It turns out when we use the term natural gas, people rate that thing, that concept, much more positively. Both Democrats and Republicans do. But if we called it methane or methane gas, they would rate it much more negatively. They have much more negative perceptions of it when we call it something different. So this is it's really interesting that this term natural gas has such positive connotations, and it's probably from the word natural in its name. In fact, we can kind of tease that out by looking at these three columns on the left. The natural gas is very positively rated, methane is negatively rated, and adding the word natural to methane gas is kind of in the middle. So the word natural has kind of this positive effect on people's perceptions of it. So it's an interesting example of how the way that we talk about something, the way we refer to it, has an effect on how people perceive it. This is the word associations. We asked people, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of this? In the term natural gas, these are the words that most commonly appeared. Things like natural, cooking, clean, fuel, energy. And then in the methane conditions, it was more about greenhouse, cows, pollution, climate, warming. So we see some different associations that rise to the top here with these different terms. And there's been a lot of research recently investigating how the way that we talk about renewable energy and other sustainable technologies, the way that we talk about it influences support for them. For example, there was a great study by Leah Stokes and Chris Warshaw in 2017 that showed that if we emphasize different effects of renewable energy policies, like its costs effects, job creation effects, climate change effects, the effects of the policies that we emphasize influence support for those policies. And they influence support differently for Republicans and Democrats. So strategically choosing which effects of the policies to emphasize as you're pitching them to people, that can affect whether or not they support it or the degree to which they do. And then there was a really interesting study by Lauren Feldman and Saul Hart that showed that if we talk about renewable energy as reducing pollution, a lot of people support it. But if we say it's going to reduce pollution and limit climate change, well, then all of a sudden it doesn't have as much of a positive effect among Republicans. Introducing the word climate change as being a reason to pursue renewable energy starts to deter Republicans from supporting it. So, and this is, stemming from this strong partisan polarization that we see on the issue of climate change specifically, and how it's become really a kind of a trigger point in modern American politics. So in one of our recent studies here, what we decided to do is we wanted to compare how people would respond to a message about renewable energy and its benefits if we emphasized one of three different benefits. If we emphasized its ability to reduce energy costs, if we emphasized its ability to reduce global warming, or emphasized its ability to create jobs. And there's been some other experiments that have tested similar things. What we wanted to do is not just test how people respond immediately after the message and their immediate responses. We wanted to see if we could change people's beliefs in the long term. So we had a pretest where we measured their attitudes and beliefs in a baseline measure, and then we exposed them, randomly assigned them to one of these different messages about renewable energy, emphasizing one of those 3 different attributes. And then we followed up with them again to measure their beliefs in a post-test. And then after that, we also followed up again after 10 days to check in and see if their beliefs, if the effects on beliefs were still durable, if the effects still were hanging around and lasting. And then we followed up again 10 days later to see if those effects were still lasting. And these are the 3 messages that we used here. So we had an economy and jobs message describing how renewable energy can create more jobs and add dollars into the economy, a very similar message emphasizing the cost savings of renewable energy, and a very similar message emphasizing how renewable energy can help stop global warming. And so we randomly assigned everyone into one of those 3 conditions, and we found some really interesting results. So I'll walk through these really quickly and then we'll wrap it up here. So let's look at these first results. These are in time 1 here, the first column of each of these panels. These are the immediate effects right after we show people this message. What are the effects on what they believe about the characteristics of renewable energy? The top panel here on the left, panel A, is about the costs of renewable energy, and we see really large effects on people's beliefs about renewable energy's ability to reduce costs. And similarly, we see some pretty large effects among both Democrats and Republicans on renewable energy's ability to increase jobs and boost the economy. And this was the effect of that economy frame. And similarly, some smaller effects on beliefs about global warming, but we see pretty big differences here between the effect among Democrats and the effect among Republicans. But the interesting part, I think, is that these effects tend to persist over time, or at least the effect of the cost frame on beliefs about the lower costs of renewable energy. Panel A there, we see that on the top left, we see that though about half of that effect remains over time. After a period of about 3 weeks, when we checked in with people again, we could still see the effect of being exposed to that quick little message. So that effect was very sticky, that stuck in people's mind, and they really remembered it even 3 weeks later. However, the effect of the economy message on beliefs about whether renewable energy has positive effects on the economy, that has some more interesting nuance there. We see that a lot of the effect remained for Republicans, but almost none for Democrats. And then conversely, we see on the the effect of the global warming message, we see that not much of it remained for either party, slightly more, very tentatively than among Democrats, but really there's not a noticeable or substantial difference there. So we see that the effect of the cost savings frame, the cost savings message, had the largest effect on beliefs about renewable energy, and also those effects stayed longer. They were more durable, more resistant over time. And this adds to this body of research showing that people are most concerned about the costs of renewable energy. They aren't quite that motivated about its economic effects or its global warming effects. What really motivates them across the board for Republicans and Democrats is how it's going to affect your own pocketbook. And that's something that really resonates with a lot of environmental psychology literature that emphasizes that we need to be making very proximate appeals. We need to be emphasizing the immediate threats and immediate benefits of these sustainability issues, rather than talking about things that are invisible and slow moving and very far away. Among some people that might resonate, but among most people, they're mostly just cared about how things are going to affect them and the people immediately around them in the very near future. So this is all under this umbrella of how we can use our knowledge of psychology to improve strategic communication. And it's really an important issue that we should be focusing on in our research, because it's not necessarily easy. Even among people that have positive attitudes or already support renewable energy, we often see what's called a value action gap, where they have strong positive opinions about sustainability topics, but they never actually take action. So among these people that have strong positive opinions, there's still a lot of work to do in designing ways that we can motivate people to actually cross this bridge and taking action that resonates with their strong positive opinions. And there's a lot of good social psychology and communication work that has found some really interesting strategies for how to do that. But of course, we'll have to save all of that for another time. And then among people that have really oppositional or negative opinions about sustainable issues or sustainable technologies, it's often very tempting to fall into unproductive or harmful patterns of communication. It's easy to get frustrated and to just kind of throw up your hands and say out of frustration, read a science book, you moron. But that's not very effective. As we know that's not going to be very effective, and we have to be able to translate these communication strategies into methods that are going to be resonating with people's values, speaking their language, kind of meeting them where they are. And that's really the science of science communication. And that's the focus of most of my research. And I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of kind of the climate of public opinion on renewable energy right now, where it's been, where it's going, some of the reasons why, and a few pieces of evidence towards effective communication strategies. So thank you again very much for your time.
Dr. Gustafson, thank you so very much for this introduction. This has been a fascinating, interesting, a little depressing, but it's really good to get the update. I mean, I think it was particularly striking to me to see the incredible change that was noted between 2018 and 2021, right? So the recency of data really matter, and understanding the trends in those gaps, right? I think that many of us in the climate communication space were feeling kind of good a few years back, right, about how those gaps were lessening, but they are not static, obviously, and so that's a really dramatic finding. So if you have questions for Dr. Gustafson, please put them in the Q&A. I have several, but I'm going to really try to emphasize questions that are coming from the group. So I'm interested, and one of our participants is also interested a little bit in method right here. And so the first question from a participant is regarding methane and natural gas. Did you ask people if they knew that natural gas was methane, right? Not everybody may know that they are one and the same. And does that account for a more positive view of natural gas?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. The short answer is yes, we did measure it, and people are all over the board. So we asked people basically how similar are natural gas and methane, and we gave them a little diagram of like the response options on that question was a diagram, like a Venn diagram. So one response option was 2 circles that don't overlap at all. Another one was 2 circles that overlap a little, and then 2 circles that overlap about halfway, and then almost all the way, and then completely overlap. So it's kind of a clever way of presenting similarity as the response options to this question, like how similar are natural gas and methane? Got it. And so the correct answer, I believe, is that they're extremely similar, but not quite. So what we found is that most people answered right in the middle of the scale. It was kind of a normal distribution right in the middle of the scale, such that most people said there was some similarity, and then a few people at the ends of the scale said that there was either no similarity, like no overlap between the 2 concepts, and then a few people said they were the exact same thing. So it was kind of this normal distribution in the middle of the scale. But still, I mean, the idea that people understanding the difference is responsible for the results, that's definitely a possible explanation. But my guess is that very few people know really what either of those things are. And so for most people in the survey, it was just their general impressions. They don't really understand what either of those things are or what the difference is. They probably are just operating off of their general perception that they've kind of soaked up as being in society. It's not really driven by a lot of knowledge about the concepts themselves.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Another question just fresh in the Q&A from Blair Chan. Are you aware of public perception on carbon capture and storage and how this varies by party? Have you done any work in that area?
That's a really good question. I don't have any data on that. I wish I did, because it is a big question of how much resources should we pump into this and how much public support is there for that. So it's a great question. I wish I had that. And you can stay tuned to the YALE program on climate change communication, because if they get more data on that, they will publish it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question to me also, because I think that the notion of renewable energy or natural gas or wind and solar, those have been in the sort of public discourse, a lot longer than carbon capture and storage or carbon sequestration, depending on how you call it. And so, at what point, has something been around long enough, right, that we are sort of absorbing it more generally and forming perceptions? I mean, I don't know if that's something to go into at all, in terms of, when you're ready to test on a topic, right? But it can take a while for sort of public perception to warm up to the idea that, for example, wind and solar actually aren't the most expensive thing on the block. It takes for those to absorb that. I don't know if you have any comments on the recency or non-recency, right, of terminology or concepts before it's time to test them.
Yeah, I think it really varies. I mean, there's some concepts that spread really quickly, like the Green New Deal. We saw that I think it was an increase of about 40 or 50% of the American public became aware of the Green New Deal in just that 4-month period that we studied it. Yeah. So from when we first studied it to 4 months later, there was like 50 percentage points more of the American public that were aware of the Green New Deal. So that concept spread really quickly. It went from very few people ever hearing about it to just 4 months later, most people were at least a little familiar with it. So things can spread really quickly. I don't think that carbon capture and storage is spreading as quickly as the Green New Deal. And I guess if I were to offer a guess about partisan polarization or difference in opinions across political groups, it would be that there is going to be significant partisan polarization on it, because it's specifically a response to climate change, and that public opinion is currently polarized. There are a lot of ways in which you could see renewable energy as not necessarily being a solution to climate change. You could see it as a way to create jobs, or ensure energy independence, or reduce costs, or go off the grid, or whatever. It doesn't have to be about climate change, but carbon capture storage is directly related to climate change.
Right, great, good point. Thank you. Okay, Stephen Sanford asks, in areas of the country where renewable energy will likely be more expensive than traditional generation, i.e. the Northeast, at least in the near term, what is the best way to approach someone who is mainly concerned with cost? Do you have any thoughts on a best approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's still reason to support renewable energy at a broader scale for the larger benefits around the world and across our country, whether or not that you specifically are able to introduce it into your own life as the most cost-effective option. So even among those people, there's still reason to support renewable energy overall in the broad sense. But of course, we have to recognize that most people are concerned about what's going to be best for them in the immediate short term. So in those cases, I'm not entirely sure. I don't really know what the best option would be for them. It is tough to get people to do things that are inconvenient or expensive. However, in that 2018 study, we found that about 50% of Americans were willing to pay more for renewable energy. They're willing to spend more money on their electricity bill every month in order to get their electricity from clean renewable sources. So that's an important data point. It may have shifted a little over time, and if it shifted, it's probably in a partisan polarization form. Mm-hmm. So probably a lot of liberals or Democrats in the country still are willing to pay more for electricity to get it from clean renewable sources. And in those kinds of situations, that could be an opportunity.
That was actually going to be one of my follow-up questions, was to what degree in the methodology of your research are you actually posing trade-offs, right? So it can be easy to say, yes, renewable energy is great, and it's a priority for me. But when you're forced with saying, well, it's either this or that, right? What might you be willing to give up in order to get this? right? I don't know how much of that informed your approach to the survey, because the answers from the same individuals can be quite different, right? When they're faced with a more immediate sense of, oh, I can't have everything. It's not sort of just hypothetical pie in the sky. It's a real, to what degree is it a zero-sum game? And do people respond differently under those conditions?
Yeah, that is really important. And in our surveys, we try to incorporate some of these more difficult questions. It's easy to say that you support, renewable energy development, but then not do anything in your own life. And that's part of that value action gap. But we do include things like people's willingness to pay more for electricity from clean renewable sources. And that kind of data there's less support for that than there is support for developing more renewable energy at the national level. But like I said, we still see, about half of Americans say they'd be willing to spend more to get their energy from clean renewable sources. But overall, your point really points to the importance of doing applied field research. So instead of just studying what people say they're going to do, or maybe even studying the effects of communication in a controlled lab environment for an experiment, it's important to take these findings and test them out in the real world. Can we actually change adoption of renewable energy technology? Can we actually change public behavior? Can we change the actual, votes on a ballot measure? Applying this stuff in the real world is really important. And we've done a little bit of work on that. And we find that there is a pretty good correspondence to the effects of the messages that we see in the lab and then the effects that we see out in the real world. So we are learning real practical insights. And when we try to apply it in the real world, it oftentimes it does pan out. So, which is really encouraging.
Does that play into your thoughts for your own future research? I mean, I know that it's more expensive, it's more time consuming, it's more complicated, right, than running a survey. But what are your hopes in terms of your empirical contributions to the fields going forward?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of my mentors encouraged me to always apply the so what test to every project that I am involved in. And I really appreciate that. And I'm trying to apply that more and more rigorously. Like, I don't want to be just doing things that are interesting to me or interesting at like a philosophical level. Like, I want to be doing things that actually have an effect in the real world that really make a difference. And so what does that look like? What is the most influential study? And I think some of the most influential studies really are these field experiments and the deployment of actual messages in the real world, and see how much they really do move people. And we've done some of that work recently. We just had a study coming out showing that we can tailor digital advertisements on YouTube and Facebook and on internet sites to Republicans that use messengers, so spokespeople that resonate with Republican values. And we deployed those in a couple of different congressional districts in the United States. And there was over 1 million impressions, views of these ads on the internet. And we found that we moved Republican public opinion on climate change by 10 points in each of these congressional districts in a period of a month.
Wow. Is that published yet? I'd love to see the study.
Yeah, it just came out in Nature Climate Change this summer.
Great. Okay, we'll have to look for that one. Fantastic. Okay, going to the next question. Thank you. Sam Evans Brown asks, do we know to what degree there is divergence between rank and file Republican survey respondents versus elites? His anecdotal observation is that lawmakers in particular are more polarized on this issue than the available polling would suggest.
That's a great question. So there's some research on this showing that elected officials tend to misperceive their constituents' beliefs or desires or opinions about political topics by quite a bit. So on the topic of climate change, for example, most elected officials underestimate how strong the support is among their constituents for climate action. And that's a really telling finding that there's all this broad support out there, as we can see, through those public opinion maps that I showed earlier, but most elected officials are not aware of that. And so, yeah, I think elected officials are more polarized than the public is, especially on the issue of renewable energy. I think the common assumption is that renewable energy is just as polarizing as climate change. And unfortunately, it's trending that direction, but it's not quite there yet.
Thank you. Judith Kola asks, she's interested in knowing the differences between research and development perceptions regarding a carbon tax, if you have studied that. Or sorry, not research and development. She said R/D, and I thought research and development, but actually we're talking about Republicans and Democrats here. So what differences, if any, might you be able to comment on perceptions for carbon tax?
Yeah, so we do have that. Forgive me for 2 seconds as I scroll through the slides to make sure it's not actually in there, because it might be. Yeah, okay, so let me share my screen really quick and I'll actually pull up the results right here. All right, so you should be able to see my screen, and this one on the second from the bottom here. So this is support for requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a carbon tax and use the money to reduce other taxes by an equal amount. So that's the question that we posed to people, and then they responded with their degree of support for that. And the figure shows the percent responding either strongly support or somewhat support. The other response options were strongly oppose or somewhat oppose. So we can see that 31% of conservative Republicans strongly or somewhat support it, about half of liberal or moderate Republicans, and then we see a strong majority among Democrats for that.
Got it. Thank you very much. Okay, another comment from one of our attendees who finds it interesting that as Trump became more radical in 2018, the Republican Party became more radicalized. And now we see this trickle down to support for renewables amongst their base. Do you want to comment on that at all? And maybe on the question of how long that we might have a lag effect there, we're under a different president now. Obviously we'll have another presidential election in a few years, and we'll see which way the wind goes there. But if you had a crystal ball, right, how sturdy would you say that this trend is?
Yeah, it's difficult. I guess it depends on how long Trump is kind of in the spotlight in that audience. So there's a lot of political psychology that demonstrates the effect of elite cues, which basically means that people pay attention to issues and are persuaded by and kind of orient their opinions around the things that they hear from the opinion elites, the kind of the leaders or the respected people within their tribe or group. So for a long time, of course, Donald Trump in that administration was the kind of the driving force or the band director for the Republican Party, and a lot of people are responding to that and seeing a lot of support, among their friends and family, and all of those social norms plus elite cues, really add up to a strong influence that moves the conservative America in that direction. So it's hard to know how long that's going to last, but my guess is that what it's going to take is a replacement. It's going to take a different leader, somebody else who has a similar persuasive effect and can similarly motivate people and move them in a different direction. So it's really going to need a equal or greater force in the other direction.
Right. And that's a very interesting question to, as we experience, the first and soon second, years of the Biden administration. Does this administration have that kind of, persuasive effect, right? Is it as strong in its potential impact there as our previous administration? So we'll check back with you on that question, unless you have an answer now.
I don't have an answer. All I can say is that Democrats are probably not going to be doing any persuading of Republicans, and vice versa. What it would take is a moderate Republican to persuade Republicans.
Randy Spidell asks, did you ask anything about the education level of those participating in this project, whether or not they have a high school diploma or a GED, college or graduate degrees, etc.? Yeah,
that's a really great question. Let me share my screen again. So, and I often get the question of like, why are you focusing on politics? Why are all the figures broken out by political views instead of other demographics?
Right.
And one of the reasons is because that's where we see the most variation on these opinions. So this is the percent of people who would pay more for renewable energy. The yellow line across is the national average. Just under 50% would pay some amount more to get their electricity from clean renewable sources. And we see that on the far left here by income, there's actually very little variation. income really doesn't make that much of a difference. There's not much of a variation across income segments in your willingness to pay more for renewable energy. Same thing with race or ethnicity, what type of area you live in. A little more variation by age, with younger folks being more willing to pay for more for renewable energy. Some big differences by education, and then also some beliefs about renewable energy, like the effects it would have on the job market or economy, or beliefs about whether fossil fuels are harmful. But even more so than those beliefs about fossil fuels and beliefs about the effects on the economy, the greatest variation that we see is along political segments. And so that's why we're so interested in how it breaks out along political segments, and we're not quite as interested in how it breaks out along lines of income or education.
Although the difference there on education was not trivial. I mean, that was it seems, I mean, that was right up there. It wasn't as polarized as political, but there was still some significant variation there.
Yeah, definitely. And some of that could be due to familiarity. Like people that have a higher education level are more familiar with the benefits of renewable energy and what it is and what it would mean. But yeah, some of it could be, if we held familiarity constant, we might still see that pattern across education. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've got two last questions. I think we can squeeze them in our last few minutes here. One from Elizabeth Wilson, our director at the Irving Institute, who asks, who states, Jane Myers' Dark Money and Leah Stokes' Short Circuiting Policy, both really interesting volumes, both discuss huge financial investments in creating this polarization and gaps between Democratic and Republican voters, right? So these things didn't just happen by themselves. Can you speak to this quote unquote investment in climate and renewables information manipulation and what it means for us? Big question.
Yeah, and a lot of this discussion goes back to a book and documentary called Merchants of Doubt that described how there was a lot of coordinated campaigns to create doubt about pretty settled science on a lot of different issues using the same techniques and tactics. And it's really opened a lot of people's eyes to the coordinated disinformation efforts that are at play here. And we've seen, I've seen some other reports about how coordinated ad campaigns basically defeated some ballot measures on renewable energy, I think in Oregon and Colorado, or Washington and Colorado it was. So this is something that happens. And unfortunately, the side that's trying to defeat renewable energy and preserve fossil fuel interests is much better funded, much better coordinated, and they really know what they're doing. They're extremely effective. So that is discouraging. However, I think that all of that action is out of desperation. I think they know that they're cornered and the writing's on the wall, as it were. So I think that the world is trending in a positive place in terms of where we get our energy from and how we move around. And I think that we can take that as being a positive sign, despite the fact that there's all of these really scary and powerful forces that are trying to slow the progress.
Sobering. Thank you for trying to be positive in the face of some sobering facts and trends. Okay, last question, and then I'll do a little bit of wrap up in terms of our coming events. Sam Evans-Brown gets the last word here, and his question is, do we have any data on the effect of information source on Republican opinion on clean energy? For example, is it more compelling to hear that renewables are increasingly cost competitive and a good business decision if the message is delivered by, say, a major manufacturer? Interesting idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So kind of merging the last point in this one, we've done some research on perceptions of fossil fuel companies, and we find that they're almost unanimously distrusted. So they would not be a good source on anything energy related. And so greenwashing
among everyone, regardless of political party.
Yeah, there is some some differences across party, but still very distrusted among Republicans and conservatives also. So on the positive side of trying to find an effective messenger, let's say for Republicans or conservatives on the issue of renewable energy to try to combat this polarization, that's a great question. And we've done some studies testing the effectiveness of different messengers just on the topic of climate change in general. Like that big field experiment where we were able to shift Republican views in the wild in these congressional districts. We used a few different messengers. One of them was a video recorded by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist and evangelical Christian, and she talked about how her Christian faith is in alignment with taking action on climate change. And then another video was a video by General Ron Keyes, who's a 3-star retired general, and he talked about how climate change has national security implications. And then the other one was Bob Inglis, a former congressperson, who talked about how conservative values align with taking action on climate change. And so those 3 different messengers we found were very effective. We did a lot of kind of pilot testing in lab environments to make sure that these messages were going to be effective, and people responded really positively to these particular messengers. And that's part of why we had such a noticeable effect out in the real world, is because these are people that that group will trust. It's coming to them from the same or a similar place. They see them as part of their tribe or their in-group, and they can approach the message with a lot less skepticism when they see that.
Fantastic. Abel, thank you so much for joining us this hour. This has been fascinating, important, sobering, and I really look forward to continuing to watch your work as it evolves. And keep up on doing those field studies. I really couldn't agree more about the importance of getting data in a real situation. So thank you again for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and feel free to reach out anytime with any questions.